get things going here. Welcome everybody to today's virtual town hall. This is, I think, the first one ever done by BC Athletics, so stick with us and hopefully everything goes along smoothly here. Cliff, our technical manager for road running, is kind of working the back end of this, so you can shoot him any questions if you have any technical issues or difficulties along the way. Before we get started, just wanted to begin by saying that BC Athletics recognizes the impact this pandemic has had on our athletes, our coaches, and our volunteers across the province. We know that sport plays a significant role in everyone's mental and physical health, and as we face these heightened stress during these times, we know that not having sports as an outlet has been especially difficult. That said, we're hopeful that we are now just starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and that when time comes, we'll be able to restart our sport under these guidelines and get back to doing what we all love. So the agenda for today's town hall is, after my introduction, I'll pass it over to Brian, the President and CEO of BC Athletics, to provide an introduction to the day. And then I will then spend some time going over our Return to Sport Phase 1 plan, followed by an opportunity to go over some submitted questions that came during the registration time. And then we'll have some time at the very end for some Q&A. Just so some housekeeping, you guys have all been auto-muted, but you are able to ask questions in the dialogue box and encourage you to do so. We'll try to get to those all in that last portion of the town hall. But if just knowing obviously there's about 100 of us on the call, we may not be able to get through all of them. And in that case, hopefully we can answer them via email offline. The town hall is being recorded and will be posted to the BC Athletics website in the coming days. We'll pass that on to Brian, who'll take over for an introduction. Brian, you there?
Okay, good. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being part of tonight's town hall. We hope that it will be a benefit to you in giving you an update and a landscape of where we are and what we're having to manage at our end of the sports spectrum, where you are, where rubber meets the road, having to do more than we are likely doing. I want to just run over a few things before I get to the landscape for athletics in BC. On the questions around membership fees, the board of directors will determine the status of those after the end of May. So we as staff can't give you any more update because the board will determine that later after the end of this month. But we want to let you know that our regular insurance for sport injury or accident and liability for regular training of an individual or whatever we move towards, the athlete support, the coaching education online, the officials training that is expected to come online within a few weeks, and membership benefits are all there for you and any of the members of the association. So all of that is still in place, and when we talk about insurance later on, it'll be that little blip that we've got to address in some way. Nationally and provincially, nationally and the provincial territorial associations for athletics, we engage monthly with a branch council meeting, and then every 2 weeks we are online with the executive directors from all of the branches, sharing information about the current situation we're in, hearing how far along they are in returning to training and accessing facilities, and any other issues that we can have and bring to the table for sharing. I want to be sure that I extend my thanks, and let you know how great all of the BC Athletics staff have been in terms of working and turning 180 degrees to make things possible for the sport to continue in this way at this time. And as I referenced in the information that you have received as an introduction to the plan, Chris and Cliff have been the lead on the return to sport plan for training, and will be for the developing of the one that will be for competition as we move forward. But also Jen Brown, in terms of her work with Athletics Canada and the web and the coaching education and webinars that she and Chris and AC have worked on, and some of you coaches have been involved with, as well as Sabrina doing the at-home version of RJTW and working with AC and Saskatchewan Athletics to make the training of leaders possible online, which we hope is just on the verge of being initiated. And to all of you, and including Sam, who is dealing with all of your questions and managing and monitoring the membership, I want to extend our thanks to you, all of you, for your work in dealing with this issue at this time, and to encourage you to stay the course as you can, and to follow whatever framework that we're handed to and develop as part of our plan by the provincial government. The landscape of athletics in BC can change overnight, as it did when COVID hit. And as we moved through, and in the most recent week, changing how we as an association and all sport associations in BC have to respond to changing guidelines and policies from the provincial health officer and the government through the Ministry of Sport. And as I indicated to you in the preamble, as early as recently as March or as May 12th, there were changes that we had to adjust to. And what is happening now is that instead of us developing our back to sport plan and forwarding it and having it approved by Via Sport and the health authorities, we have to wait now for a set of overarching guidelines, and then take what we have produced and is in draft 3 and vet it against those to be sure that we're in alignment, and then send it off to the Via Sport and government. And then we then must have the okay that we're good to go. But then the board of directors of BC Athletics has to then approve that document and that back to sport plan. And as well, the club boards will have to do the same. This is a directive that's come to us from government through Via Sport, that those are, at this point in time, the steps that are required in order to move forward with our back to sport, return to sport plan. One of the biggest factors is that we were made aware just recently, within the last week, that insurance companies are reluctant to respond to COVID-related claims relative to liability insurance. And so that means that when the boards of BC Athletics and the clubs approve the back to sport plan, we have to be sure that that plan is so bulletproof and has been vetted legally that there is little opportunity for anyone to file a claim against the club and the association for any COVID-related illness that may arise from a back to sport engagement. because the individual directors at the association level and at the club level and the officers of the association, provincial association, will be then personally liable for any actions at this point. This is what the insurance company has told us. So the insurance that we carry is through Sport BC Insurance, and their underwriter is Markel. And we know as recently as today that Sport BC is in discussions with a number of underwriters looking at the way through this quagmire of liability to find a way that any claims arising out of any COVID-related issues and a return to sport plan will be honored by the insurance companies. But until we know that, we're putting everybody on alert to let you know what we're having to deal with as a provincial sport organization, and yourselves as individual clubs and coaches. So that makes it a bit challenging, but there's always some positives that come out of it, and we're looking forward to creative solutions coming not only from the insurance companies but from yourselves in terms of looking at the plan, giving us your feedback, and helping us to move forward with a return to sport in a safe way for everybody. So your review and feedback on the plan is critical. Your ideas and possible solutions on the issue of liability insurance and your commitment to work collectively in support of the return to sport plan for athletics in British Columbia is very, very important. I know it's frustrating or can be frustrating, and you have to do a lot of running on the spot or throwing in the circle a lot. And it's challenging not to be with athletes and your athletes to be with their buddies. But it's something that we're going to work through, and we will come through, and we're on the verge of entering into that return to training, and we just want to be sure we have all our ducks in a row before we can actually launch the plan and have it approved by not only the BC Athletics Board but your club boards as well. So Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Sorry, just had some issues getting off mute there. Thanks, Brian. So just an overview before we get into the nuts and bolts of the plan. So as per direction from the provincial health officer, all return to sport guidelines needed to cover three things. They were processes to return to sport safely, measures to keep people safe to avoid further outbreaks, and a plan in the event that a case or an outbreak should occur. So addressed in this document are limitations to group sizes, physical distancing measures, minor modifications to sport activities, and overall we were required to put an emphasis on skill development and community-focused sport activities that take place within the home sport community. So this means avoiding cross-regional, interprovincial, or cross-country travel for sport at this time. And also key to this phase was that competition was not to be a part of this phase and will be included in further phases down the line. In terms of our audience for this document's really targeted to all members of BC Athletics, whether that's clubs, coaches, athletes, officials, parents, spectators, and it's also for athletes that are a part of clubs or training and competing unattached. So getting into it, we've broken it down into a number of different sections. This one probably being the longest is just the individual responsibility. And I'm just gonna make sure our annotation is clear. Thank you. And sorry, just bear with me one second. So the following individuals are not permitted to attend a practice or a training venue. And these are all things that you guys are going to have seen in the news, but obviously any person that's experiencing any symptoms of COVID-19 should not be attending a practice or a training venue. And obviously if someone starts to experience any of those symptoms while at a training venue, they would be asked to leave immediately and contact their local public health office for recommendations. They would also want to inform their club and their personal coach that they are experiencing those symptoms. Any person who receives a diagnosis for COVID should also not be attending practice. Any person that's been told to self-isolate at home for whatever reason that might be. Any person who lives at a home that's been in close contact with someone with symptoms of COVID-19. Any person who lives in a home that's been in close contact with someone else who's been told to self-isolate at home. And any person who has arrived in British Columbia from outside of Canada within the last 14 days, as they should be self-isolating. We're also asking individuals that belong to a higher risk demographic category for COVID-19 to consult with a provincial health organization or their personal doctor before they begin to participate in sport. Obviously, we need to be adhering to those social and physical distancing measures by keeping 2 meters or 6 feet away from all others at all times. And washing our hands often, as much as possible using water and soap, but if not, using any of those alcohol hand sanitizers that are available. Again, obviously, trying to avoid touching your face as I'm doing now, your eyes, nose, or mouth with unwashed hands, and proper hygiene measures that we're all become well aware of, but ensuring we're not sharing utensils and water bottles and those sorts of things. Not shaking hands and not high-fiving or celebrating after any competition or practice. And not to loiter in the facility as well. It's going to be tough because we haven't seen a lot of our friends and coaches for a long time, so it'll be, you'll want to spend time and catch up with these people, but we need to be cognizant of the current situation. And we're also asking for a temporary suspension of carpooling unless you're traveling with someone from an existing housemate. And then if individuals choose to use personal protective equipment while they're attending a training session, that they ensure that it's properly discarded or cleaned after use. Moving into recommendations for member clubs. We're going to be asking our clubs and our coaches to obviously read this document and then also sign off on the agreement once we get to that point, showing that they will be abiding by these guidelines and processes. We're also ask our coaches, athletes, and club personnel to really follow those municipal and provincial mandates, especially when it comes to facilities. And we're going to be suggesting, sorry, just take a sip here, that the size of the individual training groups, and that includes both athletes and coaches, currently be limited to 10, feeling that that's a reasonable amount that we can work within to ensure that there's proper physical distancing and that those other measures are being adhered to. And then also still working within that total maximum size of gatherings, which has currently been set at 50, and from our understanding is a number that's going to be around for some time. But that clubs need to consult with their own facility and look at the different factors to determine what's the appropriate size of gathering for their space, knowing that obviously different facilities are going to be able to accommodate different size of gatherings. And then at this point, what we've been recommended is that even if the maximum group size is 50, that we should be cautious not to jump back to those maximum numbers too quickly. Also that making sure that sets of personal protective equipment are available on site to be worn by the coach or the safety monitor in case of an injury that requires hands-on assistance. And that, again, as stated before, that if people are choosing to use PPE, that they make sure that it's properly discarded and cleaned after use. We also will be, asking our clubs to set training schedules accordingly that will allow for the club to meet its limits on group size and to avoid congregating with athletes and coaches. So this may be staggering start times or days of the week that athletes are training, or the locations where athletes are training, whether that's in the facility or otherwise. Obviously, be educating athletes and coaches on hygiene and sanitation practices, and just to ensure that we're obviously not spreading anything. Ensuring that hand washing stations or hand sanitizer stations are available in common areas. And it's going to be up to, the coaches and the club administrators who will be tasked to ensure that everyone's adhering to these physical distancing measures. The other thing, obviously in our sport, there are some events that require some equipment. And so ensuring that those are cleaned and disinfected after each use. And where possible, having pieces of equipment that are used by a single athlete rather than having it shared, which will obviously require, sanitation in between uses. So that's anything from starting blocks to throwing equipment, hurdles, crossbars, medicine balls, etc. And if a coach is going to be the person that's managing the cleaning process, ensure that the clubs are, providing those personal protective equipment to the coaches to ensure that they're safe in those practices. The next section here is just talking about training venues and facilities. So it's important that we know that the facility owner or the operator, they're going to have their own responsibility for cleaning protocols within the facility, whether that's restrooms or other areas. However, anyone that's renting or using the space is going to be responsible for ensuring that there are sufficient protocols in place, as well as ensuring that all equipment used is properly cleaned. So municipalities are their own entity and will be developing their own set of guidelines in line with provincial health regulations. Municipal decisions will be made locally, community by community, and so this will impact sports organizations who use those facilities. That said, the following guidelines are going to be recommendations that we ask clubs and coaches to address in returning to training. So that's ensuring that, that those facilities have set schedules that allow for sports to meet those provincial and local mandates for physical distancing and proper hygiene. So that may require coordination between sports, knowing that some of our facilities are used by other sports, whether it's soccer or otherwise. Recommending that there's appropriate signage posted outside the entrance to the facility, just briefing the physical distancing measures that are in place. And probably also be worthwhile for the clubs to publicly notify, whether it's outside their venue or through other means on their website or social media, the times of day that they will be training at the venue, just to allow the public to be aware of the time and the number of people that will be training at the venue. Again, recommending that there's signage to post within the facility, encouraging good hand washing and respiratory hygiene. And then right now we're looking at a recommendation just to ensure that all training sessions are held outside, as we've been told and informed that the chance of passing things along outside is far less of a chance. So at this point, not using clubhouses, sheds, or indoor meeting spaces or facilities for training at this time. Now, that means you can obviously still go in and retrieve equipment, but you're not using it for therapy sessions or training sessions or anything like that. And then obviously just making sure and working with the facilities to ensure that there's cleaning that's going on over time and throughout the day. But again, that's going to be something that each club is going to have to work on a one-to-one basis with their facility to meet that. And that's something that's going to be, BC Athletics will not be able to micromanage. Oh, there was one more. Just things, another practice, looking at that facilities have removed and disconnected covered public water fountains, just as obviously a site that could be, passing along germs. So getting into specific event guidelines, beginning with throwing events. Obviously, for all of our event groups, all of those measures that we talked about earlier are going to adhere to each of the, or be specific to each of these event groups as well. But so obviously, when it comes to the throwing events, practicing that social and physical distancing will be important. Same with proper hygiene. But also looking at, establishing physical barriers to separate athletes from the public, whether that's using cones or markers to cordon off the areas that are going to be used for training. Athletes should be assigned their own sets of throwing equipment, or if they do have to share equipment, that obviously there's the ability to sanitize it in between uses. Athletes will retrieve their own throwing implements, and throwing implements, again, if they are being used, should be sanitized before and after each training session. And again, if coaches are responsible for doing any of the cleaning, that they're given the right personal protective equipment to manage that process. For jumping events, again, those physical distancing measures should be in place. The ability to separate the athletes and the coaches from the regular public using the facility. If there's a use of equipment when it comes to the horizontal jumps, rakes, shovels, and brooms, that those be handled by the coach or an individual and a single individual. And that coaches, obviously, if they're responsible for cleaning any of the equipment, that they receive that PPE. Looking at different strategies, and this will get down to the nuts and bolts and within each club and the number of athletes there, but looking at creative ways to ensure that athletes are able to maintain their distance while they're on the sidelines waiting their turn. And suggestion that only one athlete be allowed on the runway at one time, and that any long jump takeoff boards be handled by the coach and disinfected after use. And also looking at just using one pit at a time, knowing that a number of facilities have side-by-side pits or alternating pits. So just obviously when we're trying to reduce the amount of people congregating, to try to limit that to just a single pit at this time. At this time, the suggestion is to not have pole vault mats or high jump mats used, just as at this point we can't figure out a way that would allow for proper hygiene between jumpers. So there can be an exception made for clubs or individual athletes that train alone. But again, we look to the membership if anyone has thoughts or considerations on how we could go about using this type of equipment in a sanitary way. We are definitely open to hearing all suggestions or recommendations. So hopefully at this time that allows, within pole vault and high jump, there's still an ability to get back to doing some technical drills, and then hopefully being able to get back to using full run-ups and jumps and using those mats in the future. The next event group is sprints and hurdles. So again, following those physical and social distancing measures, separation from the public, then specifically looking at during training using staggered starts so that athletes aren't side by side, and then also making sure that athletes, they can use alternating lanes to give that distance space. So that might be lanes 1, 3, 5, and 7, for example. With equipment, it obviously must be sanitized between usages. And so hopefully there's an opportunity when it comes to blocks or hurdles that athletes are able to use a single set during, but if they do need to be shared between athletes, that there is a way to properly disinfect and clean them. And then at this point, it's probably obvious that relay practices probably should not be conducted at this point, as there's no way to properly clean a baton in between uses. Middle distance, probably the one that's been the easiest over the time to continue training, will probably be the most challenging when it comes to bringing the groups back together. But obviously looking at following those social distancing guidelines, and whether that's 2 meters in front or 2 meters side by side. There's obviously been a lot of information put out there in terms of how far back you need to actually stay from an athlete. We have not been provided any specific information regarding that. So using common sense, and probably safer to run side by side at this point than falling right behind somebody. So looking at creative ways to hold those workouts, and using hopefully large parks and outdoor spaces. Preferably staying away from the track at this time, knowing that it'll probably be a busier place. So get out and to enjoy some of our beautiful parks out there. For our para-athletics athletes, those that are para-ambulatory athletes are asked to adhere where possible to the relevant guidelines that have been outlined in this document, whereas wheelchair or seated throws athletes are asked to consult guidelines that are being published by BC Wheelchair Sports. Okay, so the next section is our outbreak action plan. And so the purpose of this action plan is to really aid in the contact tracing of those individuals who may come in contact directly or indirectly with an infected individual. So really it's going to be the responsibility of the entire athletics community to ensure we're keeping accurate records of those individuals for whom you're coming into contact with, to help keep us all safe. So specifically, all members will need to be up-to-date current members of the association, and hopefully can be providing up-to-date information with their club or their personal coach should they need to be contacted. So unattached members can contact Sam Collier, who's our registration and member services manager, or if you're working with your club, you can contact your club registrar. And we're also looking at asking clubs and unattached coaches to keep a record of not just the date, but which athletes attended each of those workouts, just again to allow to be able to contact them should any sort of infection occur. And then if you're not a part of a club, but you are training as an individual and you may be training with other individuals, just making sure you're keeping record of that for that same purpose. Obviously, that if you're experiencing any symptoms of COVID, you should not be attending any of those practices. But if symptoms do begin while at a training venue or within 14 days of having attended a training venue, that individual should leave immediately and contact their local public health office. And then they should also touch base with their coach and their club personnel immediately, just to let them know, where then that club or that coach is able to then contact any of the other individuals that person may have come into contact with, so that they are able to begin self-isolation as well, to avoid spreading it any further as it is. And then if a club or an unattached coach has a member that is diagnosed with COVID-19, we'd obviously ask that all in-person training be discontinued for a period of 14 days, and that be reported to BC Athletics, and that can be done via the BC Athletics Sport Injury Accident Report form. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And that's our plan. Again, it's obviously going to be changing, and we'll be waiting to get more feedback, but we can probably this is our best guess of what we think will be the best policies heading forward as we move into that next phase. But we look forward to feedback that we can receive from you if there's any other thoughts, questions, or concerns around any of this. During the registration process, we did provide an opportunity for you all to send in any questions. A lot, obviously, were very similar, so we were able to compile those. And so we'll try to answer a number of those right now. And then if there's additional questions, those can be asked at the end, given the time. So the first question that we received here was, will BC be able to roll out our return to sport even if other provinces are not able to? And the answer to that one is just yes. We're working on a provincial return to sport, and working within our own region here. And so we should not have to wait on anybody else at this time. And are there any specific protocols for junior development and track rascal aged athletes? These guidelines are for all of our members, and so it's going to be really up to the clubs and the coaches to be able to apply these protocols and guidelines to the various age groups and event groups, and knowing that there's going to be differences between those. So we're trying to keep those training groups small. We're suggesting 10, and so that'll keep a fairly close athlete to coach ratio there. And in some cases, there may need to be more if you're talking about younger athletes. But again, that'll take some creative thinking on the clubs and the coaches' part there to look at how that might work. And I know I've talked with a number of coaches around some of the different ideas that could make that work, whether that's staggered start times or using different days of the weeks to try to make that all work. And yeah, so I guess the question there really is just, or the answer is just, it's going to be up to the individual clubs to manage the individual context of that club, knowing their facility and the size of their training groups. The next one is a similar question, but on the other other end of the spectrum of age, are masters athletes part of the plan? And so the answer is yes, and the same answers would apply there as well. And really, especially when we're looking at an adult, that it's really up to them to manage their own individual risk. The next question is regarding 50-person gatherings. Would that include total number of athletes and coaches for the training session, or would more than 50 be allowed on if training groups are kept small? So that was addressed a little bit earlier, but as mentioned, the clubs will need to consider a number of factors to determine what is the appropriate for their space and the ability to maintain physical distancing. And again, as it was mentioned earlier, as we transition back, that we shouldn't be trying to ramp up too quickly, and really taking some time and being patient and trying to figure out, what the right number is to be able to manage all of those different physical distancing guidelines and hygiene measures. We registered for a Track Rascals program. We were told the program would be canceled this year. We would like to get an update if it could possibly resume. So the answer to that one was once we are cleared to return in this first phase, that those types of programs could come back in as long as everyone is following those various guidelines. And so that's going to be up to the individual club and coaches and those programs to determine whether or not they feel that they have the capability to follow those guidelines safely. Would Team Canada athlete members be allowed to train at their national training center like PICE? So that decision will be up to the individual facilities as well as to Athletics Canada to make those decisions. But obviously keeping in mind that in the province of BC, the buck stops with the provincial health officers. So there will be a phase back approach there, but specifically when you're looking at the West Hub there in Victoria, the decisions will it won't be up to BC Athletics on that. And the last one with regards to training was, is there a possibility of track or cross-country day camps this summer? We are hopeful. Those would fall under the similars training, and so as soon as we're allowed to get back to training, and if someone that's putting on those training camps feels that they're able to adhere to those physical and hygiene measures, then absolutely. But at this point, it's still to be determined, and there hopefully is more information coming when we receive those guidelines from government and via sport. The next section of questions is around competitions. I know this is something that's very important to really all of us. So the first one obviously is will we be able to have some form of competition during the track or cross country seasons? It's behind my screen. If in small numbers. Possibly is the answer. We're hopeful, we're optimistic, but it's really out of our hands, and it's going to be up to this virus and where things go, and we're hopeful that the trend that we've seen lately is going to allow us to get back to training in that first phase, and then if things continue to progress in a positive way, that there may be an opportunity to get back to competition in one of the later phases. There will have to be consultation with BC Athletics committees, whether that's road running, cross country, junior development, or track and field, around what those competitions could look like. And the other important part there is just around our officials, and that they tend to come from our older demographic, and we will obviously need to ensure that our officials are kept safe and are willing to help participate and facilitate those competitions. So we really do look at that as an opportunity as well to increase our recruitment for officials, and hopefully bring in some younger officials that are able to step up and help us, if we are able to return to competition this summer. Similar question: are all summer track meets canceled until 21 for junior development? So it's a very, very similar answer as the one previous. Specifically, the JD committee will want to weigh in on that and make a determination. But then it'll be up to the clubs. When we look at returning to competition, it's very likely that we will still have to adhere to those that size limit of 50. So we're going to have to be very creative in what a competition looks like. It won't look like the competitions that we're used to. So whether we're going to have to look at just specific age groups, event groups, obviously working within various regions of the province, and likely a combination of all of those to be able to make that work, knowing that the 50 would include officials and meet managers, spectators, especially parents if the athletes are minors. So it's going to be tricky, but I know we've got a lot of people that are keen to make this happen, and so hopefully working collaboratively together, we can come up with some sort of competition schedule and format if the ability presents itself later this summer. Would in-house small competitions / time trials qualify for sanctioning if entry limited to the club? And so the answer would be, possibly to this one. There's nothing in BC Athletics rules or bylaws that would prevent this, but this would also come, at the time that we return to competition. So similar to the other answers to the previous questions, and hopefully, when we move to later phases, hopefully that's later this summer, we're able to do that. The last question here is, there are very different densities of COVID-19 cases in the various provincial health regions. Providing all guidelines and safety protocols are followed, will there be a regional approach to allow areas / event groups to progress from training to small competitions at dates when it is appropriate to the specific region, and not all be locked into one provincial or national date? So the answer to that one really is possibly. I mean, it'll be a provincial directive about whether regions will differ in their timeline in return to both work and sport. So we'll have to wait on that one. And then it'll also come to the BC Athletics Board of Directors to also weigh in on that decision. It's probably unlikely that we'll see a region by region return to sport. And just probably, the first thing that comes to mind is really that cross-regional travel. Knowing that obviously there's a competition being held in Kamloops that was to stop someone from the Lower Mainland and hopping in their car and driving up there to take part. And everything that we're hearing is that we really should be staying in our local communities. So we're hopeful that the progress that we're seeing will allow for our province to come back to sport at the same time. But obviously it'll be up to the health authorities to make that determination. So I believe that's all of the questions that were submitted. I know Cliff has probably been working frantically in the background to take any other questions that have come in. Obviously, you can send emails to any of us, whether that's myself, Cliff, or Brian, or anyone else, if you want to take a question offline here. But I'll pass it over to Cliff, who will throw up some other questions if there have been any during this meeting. Otherwise, thanks for sticking with us, and hopefully you guys were all able to hear and see the presentation okay.
Brian, regarding liability, can we have members sign a return to sport liability waiver form before they come and resume?
That's what we've asked Sport BC Legal to provide us a template, and then we can create one that will be specific to athletics, as specific as it has to be. So that's our intent, and it would be something that that would likely have to go out through the club structure to the individual members, so that either the club is signing off on behalf of all of them, which is unlikely to be the right way to do it, or to have all of the individual members agree to sign off on that waiver.
Regarding individual responsibility, masters athletes over 60, does that mean we have to consult with the PHO before we start back training? I think we addressed that. This applies to all athletes. It's up to those athletes that may be at risk on whether they want to return to track. For those of us who are also frontline workers, are we excluded from coaching? Brian?
Good point. We know there are people who are frontline workers in our sport. We would almost turn around and ask what those frontline workers think, but we'll also raise that question back to the via sport and government people to help us through that one. Thank you, though, for bringing that up. That's a very good point.
Couple of questions regarding when we resume using tracks. Will BC Athletics ask the municipalities to designate lanes for them?
Will BC Athletics be asking the municipalities?
Yes.
Well, no. We wouldn't initially. We wouldn't think that would be part of our responsibility. Each of the facilities is going to have an access process and scheduling process if they're going to reopen. And I know that some facilities are so open that anybody can arrive at the track and begin walking, and there could be a track practice on, and there doesn't seem to be any respect for the fact that the club has booked it, or that's the municipal policy that anybody can use it at any time, and track clubs stay in lanes 1 to 4. I think those kinds of things are going to change. I would hope they would change, that municipalities are going to have to be very prescriptive about this is the track and field club's time, and only the track club can be there at that time. Then there are the public times when people can be there, and provided there's social distancing, they can do their walking. But I know there have been similar questions come up in our collective sport meetings about the responsibilities of municipal governments relative to facility access and scheduling. As we hear more, we'll certainly put that out to everyone. But I would recommend that for clubs who use municipal facilities, that you get in contact with them and find out how they're going to manage the reopening, and not make it a free-for-all for everybody at the same time.
This one I don't know if we'll be able to answer. What if a person returned from abroad, was sick, self-isolated, but was never tested or attended a physician? Should we assume that they are now better, or should we insist that they be tested to ensure that they're better? That's quite the what-if scenario, so I think we may need to ask that to a medical professional. Brian, the way that the email was sent out last night was worded, it appeared that all clubs must approve. Does that mean that the plan must be approved by each club for it to be approved by all clubs? Like, does one club have the veto authority?
No, the approval is by individual club. If one club doesn't want to do it, then that means they don't return to training or return to sport within that club environment. So it's based on individual clubs approving the return to sport within their community, but that'll only come after we get the guidelines from Via Sport, we vet our plan against it, it goes to the BC Athletics Board for approval, and out to the individual clubs to approve for their individual club operation.
And if the club wanted to institute more to the policy, they could do that.
More restrictions?
Correct.
Certainly, but it would be good to share them.
Correct. Okay. When you use the term club, does this include university teams, or are university teams required to follow their own set of guidelines?
Well, the universities, in many cases, are members of BC Athletics as a club. So they're going to be looking at ours as well as their own university policies with regard to returning to sport and all of the protocols related to that. So they'll have to make their best judgment with respect to that. And if there is significant variation from the BC Athletics policies and guidelines that are aligned with the provincial government guideline, then we should be made aware of it and respond accordingly, so that they're not wondering whether they're in violation of ours or the post-secondary school.
Just to clarify that this plan is a proposed plan. We have not sent it to the government yet. We do not know how long it will take to approve. It has to go from us through Via Sport to the PHO, through WorkSafe BC, and then back to us before we will able to enact it. So there's a few questions on timeline. Brian, anything to add on that?
We in a meeting yesterday with individual outdoor sport organizations and Via Sport representatives, we left the meeting saying, get those guidelines to us as soon as possible. So they are working with WorkSafe BC and the Ministry of Health, and having those guidelines approved, sending them on to the provincial sport organizations to ensure that their back to sport plan aligns with those guidelines. When we have it completed, we fire it back to them so they're aware of it, But more importantly is our own boards at the provincial and club levels are the ones that are going to need to approve it. And provided we get no negative kickback from Via Sport and other health authorities, WorkSafe BC, we should be okay with what we put forward.
Any thoughts to a fall track season? Possibly. It's whether we can keep those maximum numbers under 50 people, and that's all people on site. Officials, participants, contractors like timing, medical, everybody on site. The total restriction is 50. Chris, more to add?
Well, thanks. Yeah, we've always had track meets go through to the fall, and sometimes it's typically been more throws meets. Typically for endurance athletes, they moved on to cross country at that point. But there's nothing to stop really other than officials, from having, other meets continue into the fall. So, yeah, I wouldn't see any issues with that as long as you can, adhere to all those guidelines and have proper officials in place.
Will there be cross-country races? Possibly. It's working with that size. I would not look at it in the short term. It's something that we'll have to look at probably working into the government's phase 3 to see if we can get something going, and it will require some creative solutions. Are all the road races canceled indefinitely, as the BC government will not allow gathering of groups of 50? Vancouver Coastal Health says that restriction is going to be in place until there's a vaccine or herd immunity. I would, again, it falls into that possibly if we can come up with creative solutions, but with a road event, it's usually not economically feasible to run 50 people in a road event with the cost of traffic control and stuff. And so that's going to be a limiting factor. Most of the road I would consider done for 2020. If a club develops a method of safe use of equipment that is currently not approved on this doc, high jump equipment, what is the process that we'll need to work through the new process? Also with high jump, could we use a cover over the mats that an athlete would use, and that's changed between jumpers? What about I've lost it. What about individual jumping in pits? How long would we need to have between athletes in a sand pit? 20 minutes and 72 hours? I guess the answer there is we don't know, right, Chris? Like, we need to ask.
Yeah, Brian has contacted both Via Sport and reached out to Volleyball BC and some other sports to get their input on this. But currently, unless Brian has an update on this one, we don't have an answer on that one.
Yeah, further information that I've found relative to sand is that there is a very low possibility of transmission through sand. We will be, though, in discussion this week with both our colleagues across the country and Athletics Canada, and we have that on the list of questions that we need some clarification on, so that we're assured that we're not going to be putting people in a compromised situation if they're long jumping. We know that sand is a component of glass. Glass has a 5-day, up to 5 days of retaining the virus if it's on glass. But we don't know that about sand. So we're trying to get that information, and we'll make sure that we provide that clarification in the return to sport plan that gets approved.
There was the question around the high jump. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, if you have thoughts and ideas around how high jump could be conducted in a safe manner, it's probably worth, bringing it to us, and we can look into how that could be, added. So we've definitely heard, and people have mentioned, the ability of putting on various covers, but we would need to look and see what that actually looks like. And there may be an opportunity to provide individual exemptions around that, but provide us the information and we can have that discussion.
Yeah, right now it's, until we get clarification, having only one athlete use the equipment is what we are recommending to coaches and athletes.
If people go to the work of planning a mini meet, can they be sanctioned, officialed, and will the results count? We're not there yet. Number one, we need to get back to training. Once we can get this approved, then we'll have the outline of what we can do to get back to competition. But number one, we need them to allow our sport to get back to training before we work on a plan to develop back to competition. They will work hand in hand. Like a lot of the practices that we outline in this would apply to competition. It's going to be a phased approach, and it's going to take time. Chris?
Yeah, exactly. And so once we get to that stage where we're able to move to competitions, then absolutely the mini meets will be, we will be able to sanction them, and they will be able to, the results will be able to count.
With shared facility and other sports in the field, the impact of 50-person limit and physical distancing is, how is that maintained? It's going to be up to you talking with your facility and how you have your booking structured with them. Brian?
Exactly. You're going to have to, the group of 50 size is still an order by the provincial health officer. And so having a soccer team practicing on the infield while you're training on the track or in the long jump area or shot put area could create an environment that isn't going to be in line with the policies and the orders from the provincial health officer. So, as Cliff has indicated, you're going to have to work with your facility owner to find out what their scheduling protocols are going to be and how they're going to be able to maintain that group of 50 size within that venue at the time of training. And it might mean if there's a soccer event training going on the infield, and they have 20 athletes training and 5 staff, then the track club may end up having to be only 25 people maximum at that point at the same time. So again, working with those municipal facility owners is going to be absolutely critical for each club to undertake.
Setting the marks in competition on the small mini meets, the person was wondering more for scholarship submissions and setting those marks. And I think, we'll get there. It's just not going to be in the short term.
Yeah, so once we get to sanctioning a meet, once it's sanctioned, then those results can be used for however you'd like to use them. Scholarships or rankings, records, all that sort of thing.
Someone asked about high jump pole vault mats. Can we find out how long mats need to be out of cycle for? Yeah, we'll put that in our list that we're asking as well. Can we assume that distance events on the track cannot happen due to physical distancing? In training right now, which is where we are, where we hope to move into, social distancing needs to be enforced, and it needs to be followed. So as your group trains in endurance, you still have to maintain that 2-meter separation. We're not at event stage, so they won't happen until we're given that permission to, until we have to maintain that 2-meter separation. Dr. David Ariano followed up that the frontline workers continue to work in healthcare regardless of their exposure to positive 19. They're assuming that we have taken the highest level of precautions. We will continue to look after even the most vulnerable populations. We only stop working if we develop symptoms. Logically, this should not restrict us from working as coaches. We have to trust the medical community and understand that they're doing the best for us in their professional lives and their personal lives.
That's great to know. Thank you so much for that. We'll certainly be sure to provide clarification of that in the plan as well.
Does BC Athletics have a source or recommendation for the purchase of PPE that for the equipment of the coaches to use and the criteria for appropriate mask and gloves? Sorry, Karen, we don't at the moment. We'll see what we can get as a list of recommendations from people. Kevin, if training is allowed through phase 1 and we have groups of 9 plus a coach, can a group include a non-certified coach if he is her experienced and sanctioned by the club committee? It's groups of 10. So whoever is in that group of 10 is fine. That you can follow the guidelines and keep yourself separated. Whether it is a certified coach or a non-certified coach, it's groups of 10. So it's as track lanes are less than 2 meters, will we need to leave more than 1 lane empty between athletes?
I believe in the reading that I've done is that it's okay when it's side to side. I mean, like ideally, for long periods of time, I think you'd probably want to have more space, but I believe that when they talk about lanes, some of the stuff that I've been reading is that it's fine to have an empty lane in between. But again, this needs to be approved. So it's not final at this point, but we're hopeful that that's the case.
Brian, if we have to strictly reduce numbers, how does a club prioritize which athletes are allowed and keep it fair for all athletes?
I think that's up for the club to figure that out. It's obviously going to be a challenge, but every club is going to have a different circumstance and context, and every event group will as well. So for BC Athletics to provide a policy on that would be challenging, if not impossible. So it's being creative. It's looking at staggered start times, different days of the weeks, with the reality that the strain will probably come on the coaches from all of this. So, some coaches and some clubs may decide that it's not possible to return to sport at this time because they're not able to meet these different guidelines. But, we're hopeful and that people are going to be, able to, come up with creative solutions here.
An anecdote is from Jen Brown, who is originally from Newfoundland, and they have the double bubble going. But what happens is that some families have a lot of children, and some of the children don't get to be in the bubble with the parents, and so there's a war between the siblings happening. So it's not unlike what you've just asked, but BC Athletics cannot set a priority relative to who gets to train, who doesn't, on what day and what time. You're going to have to work that out within your club environment. And be as creative as possible and use as many possible venues that you can get access to.
Okay, that's all the questions that we had. I just want to follow up the few medical professionals that are in there. If you see anything specific in there that we can improve, that we should keep in highlight, email Chris or I. We are going off the research that we have, and we're trying to cover things, but we don't have, we're not doctors. So it's just anything we can do to improve, please let us know if you have, or nurses as well. It's any medical professional, let us know what we can do. We're working on it. we're working very hard on it. It's taking up a lot of work. We've been trying to push through this. You know, we're in phase 0 at the moment. We're still solo training, and we're hoping to get this approved. And we're hoping to get back to sports soon. Brian?
Yeah, I just want to summarize and finish up. You know, today listening to Dr. Bonnie Henry, you know, the groups of 50 order is still in place, provided the space can ensure physical distancing. So her little phrase is lots of spaces, few faces. Keep the group small, manage the risks associated with training, and if wherever possible, use bigger spaces. So that's the guidance we have to follow, and we hope, as we've indicated already, that the guidelines come to us as soon as possible, if not yesterday, and we can vet our plan and get it out to the boards, and get it approved for operation, and have the issue of liability insurance addressed, because that's going to be critical, along with having a solid waiver for participation in training. I want to thank everyone again for being part of this. Thank you for your patience, your understanding, your adherence to the policies and orders that are being given to us, and we've translated as best we can back to you. We encourage you to review the back to sport plan that draft 3 that Chris and Cliff, together with input from individuals and committees, has put together, and to provide your feedback and ideas, because we're only as strong as all of us can contribute. So thank you again for being part of it. Stay well, and find some good fun and humor in all of this if we can. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone. This recording will be posted on the website in the coming day or so. So if you need to revisit it and look for any specific part you want to revisit, otherwise you can send us emails or give us a phone call. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you.